The Everlasting Now, Chapter 21. I was sitting in the parlor reading Right-Way Magazine, the railroad newspaper, when Mama came in with her sewing box. She was making a school dress for Swan. The hour of doom was at hand. School would be starting in 2 weeks. I showed her a drawing of a Mikado-type engine from the paper. It says here it was drawn by Jim Newman, Jr., colored section laborer. All he had to work with was a 5-cent box of crayons and a ruler. He had more than that, she said, admiring the picture. He had talent. This makes 2 artists I know about, I said. Mr. Hopper's the other one. Brother, sit under the lamp if you're going to read. You'll ruin your eyes holding that paper so close. She turned on the radio to listen to the news. The floor fan rustled the pages of the paper and droned on the warm air. White moths hit the screen, and a mourning dove called plaintively from the garden. When the news was over, Mama folded her sewing and rose to go. It seems the Duke of Windsor got married, she said. Who's he? I asked. He used to be the King of England. Now his brother, George VI, is king. I'd like to be king, I said, thinking of King Arthur. So, if you stop being a king, you get to be a duke. I knew about Duke Ellington, but he wasn't a real duke. No, said Mama, that's not how it works. The Duke of Windsor's abdicated. He resigned. He stopped wanting to be the king. Boy, that's dumb, I said. Why'd he quit? He married a woman from Baltimore, she said. That's like leaving rooms over the depot to go live with Miss Edna Earle, I said. Brother, sometimes you surprise me, said Mama. The next day there was a shout from the front hall. Brother, Lily yelled, come talk to Lucius. I don't know what he wants. Hey, Lucius, I said, going to the door. What do you want? Taking off his hat, Lucius removed a telegram and handed it to me. I couldn't believe my eyes. It had my name on it. I stood there holding the yellow envelope. Mama, I called, come quick. Swan came too, and for a minute or so we all stood at the door. It didn't occur to any of us that a telegram could be good news. Go on, open it, said Mama. Very carefully I opened the envelope and read the message aloud. Joe Lewis and team arriving Snow Hill, stop special. Train Labor Day, stop. Details to follow, stop. E.L. Edwards, engineer. Lily grabbed me so hard she nearly squeezed my guts out. Swan jumped up and down, and Mama went to get a tip for Lucius. When she handed him a nickel, he thanked her, put his hat back on, and limped back down the steps. I guess he is working for the railroad, I said. When we'd all calmed down, we sat on the porch drinking iced tea. I'm going to frame this telegram, I said. Brother, Mama said, did Lucius's hat look familiar to you? Yes, ma'am, I said. The details about the upcoming visit of Joe Lewis and his softball team did follow shortly. Mr. Edwards was the engineer of the Joe Lewis Special. His softball team, the Brown Bombers, have been playing benefit games across the South. After a visit to the county where he used to live, Joe planned a brief stop at Snow Hill. The time was short, and there wouldn't be a softball game, but we'd get to see Joe Lewis and his team. When folks heard about the visit, they went kind of crazy. Nobody famous had ever come to Snow Hill, not even the governor. When Mayor Puckett learned that I got the telegram, he came to our house. We should have a Labor Day celebration, he said, beaming. I'll oversee the whole thing. At first, plans were made for 2 celebrations, one for whites and one for coloreds. But since there was barely enough time for one celebration, it was left up to each person to come or not. The place was chosen for the event. They've got to eat, said the mayor. There was a lot of fuss about where the picnic would be. Since I was the one who got the telegram, Lily had her say, Joe Lewis is our champion, and we ain't giving him over. The decision was made to have it at Jesse's church. There was lots of room and a level playing field, just in case the Brown Bombers decided to play. Church ladies all over town planned the menu, and food was the most important thing in the world. As far as food was concerned, there wasn't a pig, chicken, rabbit, pigeon, or frog safe in the area. As plans progressed, it was decided the train would be met at the station, and Joe Lewis would be given the key to the city. Following that, everyone would meet at the church grounds. But as the big day drew near, I didn't hear anybody mentioning Champion. How come everyone's forgetting about him, I asked. Joe Lewis is his hero. Mine too, but not as much. We got to get Champion back here. It's safe now. As usual, nobody paid me any mind. Chapter 22. On the big day, a festive crowd gathered at the railroad depot. It was a beautiful day, not a cloud in the sky. Nobody knew what to expect, but they all wanted to be able to say they were there when it happened. Mr. Hopper had painted a banner that stretched across the front of the depot. Welcome Joe Louis, World Heavyweight Champion, and the Brown Bombers softball team. Mayor Puckett stood at the platform with the key to the city to present to Mr. Lewis. The high school band warmed up, and the 5 Golden Stars -1 got ready to sing. Lily was wearing her old hat trimmed with new pink silk roses. I kept thinking about Champion and how he was going to miss seeing the great big man himself. The train whistle blew one long and one short blast. Then Mr. Edwards brought the engine number 1402 into the station, slick as glass. Billows of white steam floated out over the depot, enveloping the waiting crowd. The band played, the choir sang, and Lily's hat floated in the clouds like a dream of roses. When the steam cleared, Joe Louis smiled out at the crowd from the window of his special car, and standing next to him was Champion, always lucky. Lily held out a scream, and Lucius threw our hat up in the air. "We wanted to surprise you," Mama said later, "but we had so many plans to work out to make it happen. At the same time, we were afraid something might go wrong." I couldn't believe that Champion was back. On the way to the picnic, he told me everything. He talked so fast I could hardly keep up with him. "I took the gray dog from Detroit to Atlanta," he said, "and Mr. Edwards met me and took me to Mr. Lewis's special train at the station. I was so sleepy I thought I must be dreaming, but I wasn't, and that's how I got to meet Mr. Lewis." When he finally took a breath, he said, "I've been wanting to come back." Depression or not, folks knew how to put the little pot in the big pot and come up with good things to eat. Chicken and ribs were barbecued on oiled drums cut in half. Platters were piled high with batter-fried frogs' legs, fried chicken, stewed rabbits, and pigeon pie. An entire table was filled with desserts. Jessie asked the blessing, and the picnic was underway. Seated at the head table were Mr. Lewis, Mayor Puckett, Mr. Edwards, 2 preachers, and some businessmen, including Mr. Tamplin from the hardware store. The ball players were scattered among the crowd, so everyone could meet them. Champion and I filled our plates and found a spot in the shade of a sycamore tree where we could watch everything. "I can't believe you rode the train with Joe Louis," I said. "Heck, I can't even ride on a train." And I couldn't get close to him because of the crowds. "Don't worry," he said. "I already told him about you." "What'd you tell him?" I was worried he might have said how bad it was at sports. "I told him you were my best friend," he said. We got second helpings of fried chicken and started in eating again. "A lot of chickens died for this picnic," said Champion. "It's worth it," I said. "I guess," he said, licking his fingers. "But you ain't a chicken." I looked over at the head table. When Joe Louis first arrived, he was wearing a gray suit and a Panama straw hat. Now he sat hatless and coatless trying to eat, sign autographs, and talk to a bunch of people all at the same time. To add insult to injury, Swan was sitting next to him, chattering away. "She makes me sick," I said. "Swan don't even like boxing. I had to explain to her who Joe Louis is. She's just showing off." As the afternoon wore on, patchwork quilts were spread under shade trees. Babies napped and ladies sat around in clusters, their paper fans going a mile a minute. Several games of horseshoes were in progress. The clink, clink, clink of metal against metal mixed with the sound of easy laughter. We decided to walk back down to the pond. Hard Labor Creek springs up in the hills, rushes through the woods, and goes back underground. Then it comes up in a clear stream that fills the pond behind Jesse's church. That's where he baptizes sinners. He got a baptism stick to measure how deep the water is and where the holes are. When he's saving sinners, he doesn't want to lose them. Willow trees leaned low over the still water. Dragonflies, blue as bottle glass, skimmed over the pond surface. We took off our shoes and socks, and Champion rolled his trouser legs to his knees. "My feet are hot," he said. "I'm going wading." "You need your grandpa's baptism stick so you won't step in a hole." While he waded out into the pond, I stayed behind watching a school of tadpoles at the water's edge. They'd be frogs in no time. Their tiny legs were already sprouting. I wished I'd brought a jar with me so I could take some home. Maybe Mama would let me make a pond in the garden. A wasp was buzzing around my head, and when I reached up to shoo him off, I looked over at Champion. My heart started pounding in my chest. A cottonmouth water moccasin was dangling from a pine branch directly over his head. Sometimes water moccasins will drop down on you if you're in the water or in a boat. Not only could you die of a snake bite, but you could be so scared you jump in the water and drown. Easy as I could, I walked toward Champion, keeping my eye on the snake the whole time. When I got closer, I called to him real soft like, "Champion," I said. He didn't hear me. "Champion," I said as loud as I dared. He glanced over at me, and I pointed to the snake over his head. He looked up, thrashed about, lost his footing, and disappeared under the water. Rushing over, I swam out to where he vanished. The water was barely up to my neck, but it was murky and dark. I was feeling for him under the water and tried to grab his shirt, but he began grabbing at me, nearly pulling me under. I was trying to hold on to him and keep my head above water, but I stepped in a hole and he slipped away from me. When I got my head above water, I heard him coughing and sputtering, and I grabbed him again. "Don't fight me," I said, putting my arm around his neck and pulling him into shallower water. We sloshed around a while we could get our footing in the mud. I half dragged him onto the bank, and we just lay there, out of breath, muddy and dripping wet. I looked over a little ways where I'd first seen the snake. He was gone. I took a deep breath. The willow fronds parted with a sigh. Dusty and one of the ball players, whose name was Mo Major, stepped out from the willow tree. Well, what in thunder?" said Dusty, coming over to us. "We were looking for you to have a game of catch. What happened?" When Champion realized he had an audience, he sat up and said, "Brother saved my life. I was drowning. He saved me from a watery grave. I can't swim." That scared me all over again. "That was a brave thing you did, brother," said Dusty. "Sure was," said Mo Major. "No one ever called me brave before." "I was afraid like always," I said. "I'm scared of snakes." "Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid," said Dusty. "It's when you do a thing in spite of being afraid that makes you brave." After we dried off a little bit, we walked back up to the picnic. "I have to say," said Dusty, "but you two look like drowned rats. You're going to have to face Lily and Miss Serena." "I'm lucky to be alive," said Champion. "Aunt Lily ought to be happy." "Me too," I said. Then I looked down at my clothes that were covered in mud. "Let's see if we can get you boys a little help," said Mo. We kind of hung back at the edge of the picnic while he went to talk to Mr. Lewis. A few minutes later, Mama and Lily came over to us acting real sweet. When they saw we were all right, they didn't say a thing about how we looked. I figured they were so thrilled to talk to the great man himself, they weren't too worried about our clothes being ruined. After they left, Dusty brought us some lemonade, and Mr. Lewis stayed talking to us for a while. His voice surprised me. It wasn't deep, and he spoke real soft. I guess if you're a champion, you don't have to yell or holler. "Did you always want to be a champion boxer?" I asked. "No," he replied. "I just didn't want to be poor. We were really poor when we lived here in Alabama. I didn't want my family to do without, so I did what I had to do. I got a natural talent for boxing. It's a blessing, and I'm grateful, but I have to work at it. Nobody's born a champion. Once you win doesn't mean you can't quit trying. It just means you have to try harder." At the end of the day, the food was packed up and the picnic tables emptied. Everyone scattered, getting their families together. Then, just about sunset, it was time to leave. There were animals to be fed, babies to be put to bed, and a train to catch. Nicodemus hauled a wagon load of folks to their homes. He wasn't mortgaged anymore, and the debt on the mule had been paid. I went over to the car where Mama and Swan were waiting. As Swan climbed into the back seat, she whispered, "I'm glad you didn't drown, brother." Engine 1402 waited on the track, sighing softly. Steam rose like golden clouds in the setting sun. Then everyone who was supposed to be boarding the train, even Champion. Mr. Lewis had arranged for his ticket to be left at Birmingham for his ride back to Detroit. I sure hated to see him go. At least he had on a clean shirt. Lily had seen to that. It looked more like one of mine. Champion called to me from the back window. "Keep Joe Lewis in a bottle for me till I come back," he said. Chapter 23. Time passed faster than the Joe Lewis special steaming out of Snow Hill. Life was soon back to normal. School started. Miss Cubbage is my teacher this year. She's nice, not a bit like my last year's teacher. Spoiled, rotten son used to sit in back of the class eating candy and not offering anybody any. There's a new girl in my class. Her name is Loretta Rivers. She has long blonde hair, and she smiled at me on the first day. Maybe school won't be so bad this year. I got glasses and can see better, but I hate them. You can bet your life Lamont Cranston doesn't wear glasses. Every day after school I picked up pecans till it grew too dark to find them in the rustling leaves. The tender smell of wood smoke hung on the air, and I could see the stars through the bare branches of the trees. The grape arbor out back was filled with bronze-colored scuppernongs. That's the best smell in the world. I love scuppernongs better than the muscadines, which are grapes too, only purple. Whichever kind I'm eating, I always pop the whole grape in my mouth and spit out the seeds. Swan's so persnickety she only eats the juicy pulp, spits out the seeds, and throws away the skins. Lily baked scuppernong pies. Then she and Mama made jelly and saved some for Mr. Holcomb. The last of the tomatoes were brought in, and we ate fried green tomatoes that tasted almost as good as fried chicken. My birthday's at the end of this month. I'll be 12, the same age as Maxwell. I'm not having a same age as the Maxwell. I'm having a party 'cause I think that's sissy for boys. But our boarders will be here, and Lily's making my favorite caramel cake. She had a letter from Rose who said she had a new job. She's singing at the Chocolate Bar, a club owned by one of Mr. Lewis's friends. I bet Champion had something to do with it. He probably talked to Blue Street to Mr. Lewis all the way to Birmingham. Rose said they're not as poor as they used to be, but she told Lily not to tell Jessie she was working at a nightclub. On my actual birthday, Swan got up from the supper table, had a signal from Mama, and turned off the lights. Then Mama brought in the cake with the candles burning. Judge Tarzan darted under the sideboard, his eyes black as coal in the candlelight. Black-eyed imp of Satan is what Lily calls him. She liked him, but she said he's always underfoot, tripping her up. Make a wish, brother, said Mama. And don't tell her, it won't come true, said Swan. Closing my eyes, I wished that I'd get to ride on a train before I got much older, only I didn't think telling or not telling would matter. It didn't look like it was about to happen anyway. I blew out the candles, everyone saying, Happy birthday, and we cut the cake. I got some good presents. Dusty gave me baseball cards and a Captain Marvel comic book. Captain Wooten brought me a fine harmonica. Champion sent a card that he had drawn with a picture of Joe Louis that he'd cut out of the newspaper. Mr. Edwards gave me 3 Indian head pennies and a book called She by H. Rider Haggard, which he said was a real adventure book. Try not to spend the pennies, he said. One day they'll be worth a lot more than pennies. I put them in my cigar box that I kept under my bed. The next evening I sat with the men in the parlor listening to the railroad hour on the radio. Captain Wooten was playing solitaire. Dusty was resting his eyes and Mr. Edwards was reading. The light from the floor lamp made a circle of gold around him. When the program was over, he motioned me over to the sofa and held out his book. It was the one with the essays he started reading from a while ago. This one's about riding in the cab of the engine of the 20th Century Limited, he said. I looked at the picture of that train every day of my life. Whenever I went to the kitchen or into the pantry, when Mr. Edwards began to read aloud, Captain Wooten stopped playing cards. Dusty opened his eyes and sat up straight in his chair. This was not just air or earth that we flew upon. This was the seamless reality of now. It was time that we fed into the flaming furnace. It was time that flickered in the giant wheels. This was the everlasting now. The words were like a place in a dream. Even though I wasn't sure what they meant, there was something inside them like a promise. That night I dreamed about my daddy. He was sitting in the club car at the 20th Century Limited playing cards with Joe Louis. The next morning I met Mr. Edwards in the upstairs hall as he was coming out of his room. He was freshly shaven and smelled of bay rum hair tonic. What time you have, brother? Mr. Edwards, you know I don't have a watch. He took Jubilo from his pocket. The heavy gold watch and chain gleamed dully in the hall light. According to Jubilo, it's time for you to get ready, he said. Get ready for what? For your real birthday present, he said. We're taking you for a train ride. That is, if you want to go. Had I heard him right? Had I? He was smiling to beat the band. Is it all right? I asked. It surely is, he said. This would be my very first train ride. I couldn't believe my birthday wish had come true. Of course I wanted to go, but I had to ask just one question. I sure didn't want to seem ungrateful, but there was something I had to know. Mr. Edwards, will I get to ride on the engine? Right up in the cab, he said. I nearly fell over myself going back to my room for my jacket. Everything had been arranged. The rule not to allow civilians on the engine had been waived. I was going to ride in the cab of a Mikado engine all the way to Montgomery, Alabama, and back again. Mama, Lily, and Swan came to see us off. The train was primed and ready to roll. Billows of steam curled around the depot rafters. The sharp smell of valve oil cut the air. The engine throbbed and quivered, waiting to be set free. Standing next to her, I could feel the powerful vibrations of that mighty heart pulsing through the soles of my shoes. Welcome aboard, brother, said Captain Wooten, giving me a boost up to the cab where Mr. Edwards and Dusty were waiting. The cushions on the seat boxes were dark plush. Nickel-plated reverse levers, throttle, and lubricators gleamed. Flames flickered through the glass butterfly doors of the firebox. Dials shone white. Their thin needles quivered. The inside of the cab looked like a clock shop. But I didn't see a clock. Time waits in the engineer's pockets. Down the line, signal lights glowed like the hearts of emeralds. Green! Shouted Dusty above the noise of the engine. Green! Echoed Mr. Dupree from the platform. He gave a wave and we were on our way. With a mighty roar, the magnificent machine divided the clear autumn afternoon. Dusty checked the gauges. He tapped the face on a dial with his finger. You gotta keep the gauge at 220, he said. No black smoke and don't let the safety valve lift. Every time she lifts, that's 20 gallons of water wasted. Light flashed on the rods and flames danced in the firebox. The gauge was steady and the old girl was taking in the language only railroaders understood. Steam escaped from the cylinders in a rush. The blower lifted the smoke. I heard the pounding beat of the air pumps. That's her breathing, I thought. It was like a dream, only better than all my dreams of trains. Okay, brother, said Mr. Edwards, take the whistle. I blew the whistle in his signature, a long and a short, that went wailing over the countryside. At that glorious sound, I felt like a part of the engine. My heart beat along with hers. I wanted to lay my hand on her, so she'd know how proud I was, how I felt about her. Autumn fields and orchards rushed past. People waved from roadsides and villages as the train passed by on her journey. Leaning from the window, I watched the rest of the train following obediently behind us. I saw the flash of her great pistons. Time flickered in the giant wheels and what Mr. Morley had called the everlasting now. I was so happy I felt like my heart would burst, and I knew there couldn't be anything better in the whole world than driving a steam engine on shining rails, across fields, through cities and small towns, and all across America. The end.